KDE
They are
crashed.
not
How do I fix it?
exactly, yeah. And then you have to that's takes so much time to sort out whose fault, if any,
Mhm.
is involved there. We get tons and tons of those, and it takes a lot of time to sort through. And
Mhm.
and all of this time, these are resources being spent. Everybody who works on this is not somebody who's working on actually fixing those bugs
Mhm.
or writing new features or any activities like that, because resources are extremely limited
Mhm.
in not only this world but in all worlds relating to open source. I think it's very tempting for people to imagine that there's some like a big company behind a project,
Mhm.
that there are vast unlimited resources, but the truth is, even in a large open source community like KDE, if
Mhm.
you look at any individual product that KDE makes, big ones that you've heard of like Plasma or Krita or Ocular or Console, right? There's going to be maybe 5 people max
Mhm.
doing 80% of the work in these projects. Like all of them, I guarantee it's something like that. And some fewer than 5,
Mhm.
might be 2 or even 3 people. So the resources available are extremely limited. And what people manage to get done with these resources is, in my opinion, nothing short of
Mhm.
miraculous. But it's not sustainable. As I think we saw with the XZ hack recently, is that relying on volunteers who are always a week away from burnout to provide amazing service to the world for free, this is amazing, but it is not a sustainable model.
Right.
And it turns out it may not even be a safe model.
I, like I said, this whole thing of like not everything is well supported. This isn't just a KDE thing. As a good example, in the GNOME project, the GNOME calendar is maintained by one person.
Yeah, I'm not
Like a
surprised.
very important part of GNOME that people expect that would be well supported, but pretty much
Yep.
it's only developed by George Stavrakis. There'll be like passing commits from other people. Yeah, most projects will have a couple of commits here and there from random people, and it will look like, oh, and this is actually one of the things I don't like about how GitHub does it. I don't know if GitLab show the number of contributors.
Yes,
Okay.
GitLab has a really great contributor graph where
The
you can
graph
see
is
who
useful,
committed
yes,
what.
but I mean just
Yeah.
like a raw number.
I don't know if it has a raw number,
Because on
but it
GitHub,
does
if
sort
you
contributors by number of contributions.
right,
So
right.
it's very obvious if the repo is 99% maintained by one person.
But on GitHub, there is like until you go to the graph, there is just the number and then the list of people. So it can look like most projects. It'll look like, oh, there's like 20 contributors. But if you look at the actual graph itself, it's like, okay, there's 1,000 commits from one person, 5 commits from the next person, and then go down from
Yep.
there, basically.
Very common, extremely common. And you see this pattern everywhere, I think. If you dig into almost any project, it's going to be something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just not sustainable, frankly. In some cases, that one person is going to be somebody who's paid,
Mm-hmm.
and that's a little bit more sustainable. But in a lot of cases, it's not. And even when there is one person who's paid, there's some fragility there. An example I can think of is libinput, which is maintained by the indomitable Peter Hutterer, who's been around forever.
Mm-hmm.
And he is paid by Red Hat to single-handedly develop and maintain libinput. And for years, he has been asking for people to help him out, and who's going to do that if there's no money, right? So it's just him. What happens when he retires? What
Yeah.
happens when he gets reassigned to another team within Red Hat? What happens when there's a reorg? What happens when he decides, okay, I've worked on libinput enough of my life, I want to move on? I
Mm-hmm.
mean, we're all screwed because that's the proverbial one library in Minnesota, one person in Minnesota who maintains the library, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think we all kind of need to be thinking about this problem of key components that are maintained, paid or not, by an extremely small number of people.
Mm-hmm.
We've all gotten used to getting everything for free, but the downside of free is unstable, frankly.
Yeah. There is this issue that people have already heard before, but this is a great example of it. The bus factor, or the
Yep.
whatever term you want to use for it, where if this one person dies or they retire or whatever, however bad you want it to sound, if this one person leaves, they take a lot of this how would you describe it? Like legacy knowledge, a lot of core knowledge of how the code base works. And for a small project,
Exactly.
that's not that big of a deal. Like if a code base is 1,000, 2,000 lines long, you can get your head around it pretty quickly. But when you're talking about like 10,000, 20,000, 30,000, even more lines of code, you can get back up to speed, but that project is going to take a long, long time to do so. And finding someone who wants to spend,
Oh, totally.
I don't know, a month, maybe even more, trying to understand a code base before they can even make a single meaningful commit, that's a
It's
massive,
tough.
massive endeavor. Like a good example of this is the Yuzu emulator. After they got taken down by Nintendo, there have been like all of these splits off into these other projects to try and take it over. But it's a massive code base, and emulation is a difficult problem. So trying to find people who can not only understand the code, but meaningfully change the code, that's gonna take a long time, if ever possible. Oh, your audio's gone.
Whoops. I had myself muted when
Ah,
I wanted to
okay.
unmute. I'm always doing this. I'm not very bright. Anyway, I was going to say you're absolutely right. And when you look at a very large project like Plasma or Krita, these are projects that have millions of lines of code.
Yeah,
And there's a tremendous amount of institutional knowledge
that's what I was trying to
embodied
think of, yes.
in people. And this maybe is a good segue to the KDE goal that I'm championing right now, which is called automation and systematization. And the goal of
Do you
this
have a link I
goal,
can go to, or like a...
if you go to kde.org/goals, you will see it there.
Okay.
This is a goal that was chosen by the community in the last round of voting. And the idea here basically was to externalize people's knowledge and put it into the Git repo, into the documentation system, so that the project would become more resilient to any individual person leaving. Because it does happen, right? If you look at Plasma in particular, we have lost a number of senior engineers over the last couple of years, and they've been replaced by other junior engineers, some of whom have later graduated to become new senior engineers.
Mm.
But that process inevitably involves the loss of knowledge. It happens every time somebody leaves. And so the goal here is to get that knowledge into the form of automated tests, into the form of READMEs and tutorials and internally facing developer documentation, so that it's not so hard for people to get up to speed again, and so that those things that everybody knows how to do are actually documented properly.
And I think that'll really help when it comes to things like actually getting people to join the project as well. Because it's not just for the people that are in it right now. When people say things like, oh, just submit a patch for it, like that's not an easy thing to do. Like, yeah, if someone's demanding work, it's a fun way to tell them to basically piss off. But
I mean, there's a bit of privilege involved in that, right? When you say patches welcome, what you're basically saying is you can't contribute unless you're at a sufficiently high technical level that you know more about computers and this project than 99.999% of all humanity. And maybe you do, maybe that matches you. But if that doesn't, or more importantly, if you don't feel like that describes you, you're going to feel like that's an exclusionary statement, even if it wasn't intended as such.
right. No, I get that. Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense. And
So there's this kind of this meta challenge here, which is that people want to help. People want to help in open source, but being able to meaningfully help in open source, let's call a spade, it does often require that you are a highly competent programmer. And if you're not a highly competent programmer, there are more limited ways that you can help. But that's not to say that those ways don't exist. The most obvious one is donating with your money, because then you can essentially, in the aggregate, pay other people to help. There's another drum that I like to beat, which is bug triage.
yeah, I was going to mention that. Yeah.
I feel like bug triage is the perfect entry point for somebody who is passionate about a project and has a certain amount of technical knowledge, but not necessarily programming knowledge. Because all you have to do to triage bugs is be reasonably familiar with the system whose bugs you're triaging. Because then somebody will submit a report and you will already in your head have some knowledge about, oh, I thought I saw that issue last Sunday, or wait a minute, that issue that this person is talking about doesn't seem like it's actually possible to happen. Let me see
Mhm.
what's going on. Or, oh, that issue this person is talking about is clearly affecting a different project because they're confused and they don't understand the structure of this community the way I do. So I feel like bug triage is a super empowering way for people to get started.
Mhm.